everybody, and welcome to this session of the Classes and Elites Research Seminar. My name is Magne Flemmen. I'm professor of sociology at the Department of Sociology and Human Geography at the University of Oslo. We are delighted that so many have turned up today to listen to this presentation. Please note that the Classes and Elites Research Seminar hosts more seminars like this on similar and related topics, and we have many more interesting seminars coming up in the next months. Today, the topic is on class voting, and we are fortunate enough to be joined by Dr. Erik Vestin, who has recently done very important research on this issue. Dr. Vestin is a political scientist with a PhD from the University of Gothenburg. He is currently working as a senior lecturer in political science at Dalarna University. His research is about historical trends in voting and public opinion, with a particular focus on matters of social class. In his thesis, defended in June 2019, he takes a new look at the decline in class voting and looks at whether our understanding of this needs to be reconsidered, especially as regards the role of the so-called new middle class. The new middle class, of course, has been a thorny problem in class analysis for quite some time, and indeed the different ways that these are conceptualized is a central point of contention between different approaches. Today, Dr. Vestin will present some of his research looking at how a very influential reconceptualization of this, Daniel Oesch's class scheme, might produce different conclusions about class voting in Sweden over the last decades. So without further ado, Dr. Vestin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Magne, and thank you all. Thank you. I also want to say thank you to the audience. Thank you very much for coming. It's very much a pleasure to be here. I will share my screen and then we will take off. So there we go. Here you have today's headline then. Class voting in the 21st century. I put, what does the Öesch schema contribute? And this, as Magne mentioned, this talk will be based on research that I did for my doctoral dissertation. It looks like this: the decline of class voting in Sweden, 1968 till 2014. It was a series of articles based on the Swedish national election studies from 1968 till 2014. It deals with many different themes. Some of the most important, I think, are about generational perspectives on class voting, which have been a bit absent in at least the latest generation of research into this area that has, I think, been somewhat overtly focused on period effects, so to speak, on the current political situation, rather than these more long-term trends that just continues, so to speak, behind our backs. Not looking. They're not very very spectacular. So, but nevertheless, they are important in the long term. But another theme here in this dissertation is left-right variation within more privileged part of the wage earner group, which is partly what I'm going to talk about here today. I put a link here also in the presentation, which I think Magne will make available after the seminar. You can download parts of the dissertation, at least the parts I will be spent most of my time talking about here. They are available at the University of Gothenburg homepage, or you can contact me if you want a physical copy of the whole thing. I just want to draw your attention to one thing that I'm particularly proud of, this cover of the thesis that my brother designed. This pays homage to an election poster, a Swedish election poster from the 1950s, which you can see the original poster here to the on the right, which is one of the few election posters, or even one of the very few election propaganda pieces where you can clearly see this this attempt to reinforce or foster the a wage earner alliance. If you see the text there, I guess some of you don't read Swedish, but it says löntagare håll ihop, which means that wage earners keep together, vote for the Social Democrats. And then you see this man in blue collar and a man in a suit there, and you see this woman who I think is supposed to be dressed as some kind of office worker, really trying to reinforce that the common interests of all wage earners here. Which is a lot part of what the dissertation is about too. But as Magne mentioned, the an important part of the dissertation is about discussing the class schema that has been developed by Daniel Oesch and has gotten quite popular in recent years, I think, as this map of the new and modern labor market. And this class schema, I think you can say, you can see the first hint of these ideas in an article by Hans-Peter Krisi called "New Social Movements and the New Class in the Netherlands," published in the American Journal of Sociology in 1989, where he makes several divisions within the professional middle class. And many similar ideas about divisions within the more privileged wage earner groups were also then discussed throughout the 1990s. For example, Mike Savage's book and several other authors' book called "Property, Bureaucracy, and Culture" that that discusses how we should slice this group best in order to gain a better understanding of how certain class interests play together in society today. Then in the 2000s, Daniel Oesch wrote his doctoral thesis, supervised by Hans-Peter Krisi. It was called "Redrawing the Class Map: Stratification and Institutions in Britain, Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland," where this class schema was first presented. And what is then we can start to talk about the problem here. Why do we need a new class schema here? Well, I wrote in here that one part of the setup here is the observation that class voting is declining, and Oesch's thesis is not just about class voting; it's about a number of social trends. For example, declining union membership, which to him suggests that what if we, together with observations that the labor markets are changing, we have expansion of the low-skilled service sector, we have welfare state expansion with a huge expansion of white-collar work in that sector. We also have rising female participation in the labor market. And this in total raises the question whether all old class distinctions are somehow obsolete or less relevant for today's society. And the question is then, can we construct a new class schema that capture new social and political cleavages? And the upshot here would be then that you would have, in constructing a class schema, the goal then would be to find groups that can predict certain social and political, like party choice or political attitudes or union membership, for example, that can predict those phenomena better than the old ones. And what is then the new idea here? Well, the Öesch schema is very much in the tradition of the Weberian tradition of John Goldthorpe and the so-called EP schema, and it takes very much that as its point of departure, but it also then makes some at least one very significant deviation. It has a vertical dimension, as he calls them, which he calls marketable skills, which very much mirrors the more hierarchical dimensions of the labor market, such as more qualified jobs, more higher incomes, better work security, and so on. But then he also adds, and this is his major contribution here, he adds a horizontal dimension in his way to classify different occupations, and this is then according to something that he calls work logics, which is a typology for what kinds of tasks that tend to characterize an occupation. In the full version of the schema, he uses 17 categories, but the most common version of the schema uses 8 categories, because 17, my understanding is that this is mostly a methodological consideration here, that 17 categories can be quite difficult to handle in the when we have the kind of samples that we normally have in survey research. So an eight categories is then much more practical. And what are then these categories? I took this table from a paper by Peter Landsäter and Oddbjörn Knudsen, which I think is one of the more concise summaries of this class schema that I've seen. We have here we have 4 different kinds of work logics. In some instances, this is even further reduced to 3 work logics, but here we have then the independent work logic to begin with. That's where you find employers, basically people who run businesses of various kinds. And this is also the one that is sometimes that can sometimes be can also be reduced away and classified, but these people are then more classified as their occupations as such. Then we have the technical work logic, where we have technical professionals. The typical occupation here is very much the engineer. We have organizational work logics, where we find very much managers and administrators, and then we have so-called interpersonal service work logic, where we have doctors and nurses, teachers, social workers. This is also called referred to as sociocultural professionals, and that the latter one is a term that I will use a lot throughout this talk. I also added some nice pictures here to further give you an idea about what types of tasks we are imagining here when we are, or what kinds of tasks we are talking about here when we are talking about organizational work logics. Organizational work logics is about management and administration, having people following orders, having people creating rules and routines, and getting everyone to work getting everyone in line, I guess you could say, sum it up. And then we have the technical work logic, which is essentially about handling technical processes and the physical world. As you see, I think these 3 pictures gives you a pretty good idea about what kind of people we have in mind here. And then we have interpersonal work logics, which where the main task at hand can be summarized as furthering the well-being and future welfare of clients. It's not so much, it's just like the organizational work logic. This is very much about dealing with people, you might say, but in this case, it's not about making people follow orders as much as more than figuring out their well-being and figuring out social relations and so on. How does this work? How is this then relevant for politics, one might ask? Well, Öesch makes the observation that especially the sociocultural professionals here are more leftists within the higher row of the class schema that we see here. That when I say leftist here, we are talking actually about In Öesch's version, this is very much a matter of party choice, but still this is, you can say, both a matter of economically leftist attitudes and more culturally leftist attitudes. It's valid throughout. Öesch is a little hazy, I would say, about the exact causality, whether this is whether work logic has some kind of causal effect here, or whether this is self-selection. But he clearly hints, I would say, in that direction. That it's quite clear, I would say, if you read his dissertation, that he thinks that this is the case. But he himself provides no real theoretical rationale for why this would be, I would say. That kind of theoretical rationale, however, was provided by Herbert Kitschelt and Philipp Rehm in a paper that they wrote in 2014, or published in 2014 anyway, that there they provided an idea about why sociocultural professionals are more leftist within the higher, are more leftist here, and also that it should be said that that organizational people in organizational work logics are then the more right-leaning, whereas people in technical professions are somewhat in between. They called it the mechanism that they proposed for how work logics cause political values is something that they call the generalization of problem-solving strategies. That what they say is that people generalize the type of tasks that they have to deal with in their work, in their everyday work, to the level of politics and society. And in that instance, the interpersonal work results in a more left libertarian view of society, where you are supposed to be more open and you are supposed to be more to view people very charitably, whereas organizational work logic, then which has more to do with enforcing rules and everywhere, that promotes a more authoritarian and also a more suspicious view of people, that they have to be kept leash, so to speak. They provide also some empirical evidence for this. They have a cross-sectional comparative data from the European Social Survey, where they show that work logics have predictive power on political attitudes under a large number of socioeconomic controls. And I realize now I should have mentioned this already, but so this is a thesis that Öesch mostly talks about this, not only, but mostly in terms of party choice, right? Which parties do these people work for? But Kitschelt and Rehm argues that this is also very relevant for fostering people's political attitudes. So what should this imply then? Why and what is my contribution here to this study? Well, one thing that I thought when I was reading Öesch was that I was curious about the absence of studies of how this schema applies when we look at it in an historical context. I think there are some predictions here that are at least implied in Daniel Oesch's writings that I think should be tested. And one of those things is that if the Öesch schema is better suited to describe the new labor market and a more modern politics, it should also really give a different account of the trends in class voting. We shouldn't just see that it has predictive power on how people choose their parties today, but we should also, there are also certain implications about how this should develop over time. And I think that one pretty clear implication of of his writings is that we should expect the predictive power of class on party choice to rise over time if we use this schema. If these new divisions becomes more relevant over time, then the predictive power should increase. And it should also be particularly good at explaining new parties, by which I mean left libertarian parties and right-wing populist parties, since these parties, both in Öesch writings, and I think this is the understanding in political science in general, also reflects new cleavages to a larger extent. It also has the implication, I think, that that we should be able to see that changes in class voting are based more on the changes in the distribution of positions rather than within class changes that each class within itself changes its voting behavior, where we should then in the case of like traditional, by which I mean like Erickson, Goldthorpe, Portocarrero schemas, we should then the decline of class voting that we have observed in those kinds of schemas should be related to the circumstances that politically less distinctive classes grow, people like people in service class occupations, as Goldthorpe prefers to talk about it, are more heterogeneous in their political choices, and the decline of class voting should simply be a function of that group growing bigger over time, whereas we should expect that Öesch classes would become more politically distinctive over time, so that we should expect that the predictive power of the Öesch schema should increase due to that these new classes that he distinguishes should become more and more predictive of party choice the more we get into the more these labor market trends that he describes are come to develop over time. However, what I show in one of my articles in the dissertation is that the development in the strength of class voting for these different class schemas are very, very similar. I compare the Öesch schema to a schema that we use in the Swedish National Election Studies, which is theoretically at least very, very similar to the EGP class schemas based on similar distinctions and so on. And what I find is that this across a variety of indicators here, the Kramer's V, the Nagelkakis R square, which isn't formally technically it's methodologically inappropriate, but in practice it tracks these two measures tracks each other very well. I also look at the old classical Alford index there. That's where and what I find, or rather what we found, since this is was co-authored with my supervisor Maria Oskarsson, we find that it lays it tracks each other very, very closely, not just in the broad overall trend, but even in the fluctuations, in many of the fluctuations between single elections. And another thing that we also find, as I mentioned, you would expect the Öesch class schema to be better when it comes to new parties, to have more predictive power there. And you find, you find some tendencies in that the old class schema is better at predicting support for the old left, that is mostly the Social Democratic Party in this instance, and the old right, and that it maintains so. But we don't see any see any kind of tendency that that Öesch schema would be particularly strong when it comes to the new left or the populist right. If anything, it's the reverse here. And as you can also see, I mean, just like you saw on the last picture, the Öesch schema doesn't really show any of the any kind of trend towards rising class voting as you would perhaps predict from these claims about being able to more faithfully represent the modern, more post-industrial labor market. Finally, what we also find here is that the decline in class voting is actually almost to the great, not solidly, but to the greatest extent, it's a matter of not so much a matter of classes, more heterogeneous classes becoming bigger, or as in Öesch's case, it's about that more less heterogeneous classes are becoming bigger, but actually it's about that all groups within these different schemas are changing their voting behavior to become more heterogeneous over time. So even in that instance, it doesn't really seem that the implications of the motivations of the Öesch schema really pans out in the data here. And this was also something that I wanted to show you. This is perhaps a more simple picture. This shows the development in party choice in the different classes over time, each and every one of them. And one observation that I want to emphasize here is that while we can see that it is true that the new left is particularly strong in the or at least somewhat stronger in the among sociocultural professionals than among other groups. The growth of the new left in recent decades is still very much something that has happened throughout the class structure. Even in the petite bourgeoisie, you can see that they have gotten bigger. So while there is, as I said, while there is some truth in that this group is more leftist, and that it is and these types of new left parties are particularly popular there, it's nevertheless not a unique trend in that group, which provides some kind of background as to why these measurements, these more aggregate measurements that I showed you earlier, turn out the way they do. Another implication, I think, of the Öesch schema, or of that whole discussion, is that work logics are then supposed to have causal effects on whether it's on party choice or political attitudes. It seems like the authors here are implying it in both directions, but I choose to look closer at the attitudes, as I think that is that makes conceptually more sense, or at least it makes more sense that it would the effect there, if it exists, it should be more direct and more easy to distinguish. As I mentioned, Kitchelt and Rehm, and also many others, have observed many times in cross-sectional data that sociocultural professionals are more leftist than other groups within the middle class professional collective, and technical professionals somewhat in between, organizational professionals more to the right. But there have been, at least when I started out this, there hadn't yet been any studies of this using panel data. So I figured that I would employ the rolling two-wave panels that we have in the Swedish national election studies here. It has been a part of the national election studies surveys since 1973, that in every new survey you also interview the half of the sample that you interviewed in the last elections. So that gives you some nice analytical possibilities of this kind. So we're talking about two-wave panel data here with 3 to 4 years between the time points. I put this into a first difference model, and I use two operationalizations of various attitude dimensions here. We're talking about not just about economic and cultural leftism here, but we are also talking about the distinction that I think Kitchell and Rem are introducing somewhat themselves, where they distinguish between grid and group. And I put this also into, I also test for various possible interaction effects in terms of age, whether these effects could possibly be bigger among younger people, or whether they could be bigger among politically less people who are less interested in politics. But what I find in the end here is that I don't find any of the expected changes in values among people that change occupation from one work logic to another. It doesn't seem like you become more leftist by changing to an occupation with an interpersonal work logic, and or vice versa for that matter. And sorry, and that should give us, I think, some pause about what the how relevant are these distinctions really in terms of for our understanding of why politics takes why political development takes the form it does in European countries. I also want to mention a little bit about the other work that I know has been done on this in this vein. Peter Langsäter, who is in the audience here today, and Oddbjørn Knudsen, and they had written a yet to be published, I think, paper about which takes a similar approach to what me and Maria Oskarsson does. They use the European values surveys and compares the predictive power of the EGP schema and the Öesch schema on the European Values Survey from 2008. And what they find is that these schemas make very similar estimates of the strength of class voting across European countries at that time. Then there was a new article in 2020 by Macarena Ares, which I put a link into there. She actually finds effects of work logics on attitudes in panel data. And I haven't been, sadly enough, not yet to be able to dive that deeply into this article, but it's pretty clear that she has, I would definitely admit that she has much better data than me. She uses the British household panel study, which with up to, I think it's more than 10,000 observations. But I also think that there are some coding choices in that article that are debatable. It's a tricky thing to model, so I certainly understand it. But my concern there would be that since she merges the categories of independent and organizational work logic together and the technical and interpersonal work logic together, and then she also tries to estimate the effect of changing occupation from one to the other. My concern there is that this might capture effects of becoming an employer or becoming a boss rather than work logics per se, I would say. In conclusion, based on evidence from Sweden, it is a bit unclear, I think, what the Öesch schema contributes to the study of class voting. When you look at the historical trends, they paint pretty much the same picture. and not just broadly of the historical trend, but it actually also seems like it captures short-term fluctuations in very much the same way. It's also a bit unclear, at least, whether work logics have the type of causal effects that Öesch himself hint at, and Kitchelt and Rehm explicitly propose should be there. And the trend towards the new left that has gotten stronger in Sweden and in many other countries as well. It may be stronger, but it's not unique to sociocultural professionals here. You can clearly see it in many other of these classes that Öesch distinguishes, including ones where, like the petite bourgeoisie, where perhaps you would not expect it from a class theory point of view. Where should we go from here? I think that since these analyses is, as far as I have seen, the only ones that have looked into and compared the Öesch and the EGP and other class schemas over time. And I think that it could definitely be some value of looking into more countries here, because Sweden is not necessarily, how would you say, representative or typical here. You can, when you look at, when I looked more into the details of the relationship between like variables of income and education in Sweden specifically, when in the European social studies, it seems like it's slightly different than compared to other European countries, so I think that countries like, especially continental European countries, may be interesting to look into here. It would also perhaps be interesting to look into generational differences, which is one thing I regret that we didn't do in our analysis here. You could definitely save the Öesch schema, so to speak, by looking into whether it has stronger predictive power in the younger cohorts rather than in the older ones. That would then, I would say that would be an argument for the Öesch schema. That would be pretty good. You could also look further into this. Is another thing that I regret that we didn't make ourselves. The modern methods of studying class voting, where you use the kappa index and even the lambda index by Romain Lachat, that allows for looking into whether these schemas explain the same variation or whether they explain different variation, as you can control them for each other. So you would run them both in a logistical regression and look at how much the coefficients change when you put both of these schemas into the regression. That would possibly also say something. I mean, I think when we ran our analysis here, we more or less assumed that since these developments were so similar, that they were essentially explaining the same variation. But that can, of course, also be tested more formally in that way. A couple of final questions that I think are relevant to discuss here in the broader picture, that can maybe useful for further research. The first of them is the question of, are the differences between types of professionals really based only on self-selection? That is the case that I try to make in my study of when I study the causal effects of work logics here. I mean, even people like Kitchelt and Rehm agree that not all of these correlations between work logics and political attitudes that they find are based on causal effects, but they argue that it's there. And So the case that people like me who are more skeptical have to make is to say that this is only self-selection, and that might sound a bit strong, but I think that there is definitely some plausibility in that might be the case, because I think that when you think about these matters, you can figure out. I think you can find examples where you can see that you can go into different occupations for many different reasons. You can see that but even if but even if those values, even if there are tendencies to go into certain types of professions based on political values, you can imagine, I think, many different ways of selecting into an occupation, and that doesn't necessarily make this connection particularly strong as such. I was trying to find here. I wrote some words about this that I thought summed it up pretty great in my article here, that if you're a lawyer, you can be both a fighter for justice for the poor who do not have the skills to handle the legal systems for themselves, but you can also be an upholder of the established moral and political order, or you can be a defender of individual property rights against a reckless government. An engineer can build weapon systems or develop technologies to generate renewable energy, and academics like ourselves, for example, can have quite varied political leanings, even though, quite obviously, even though we are, I think, a type of socio-cultural professionals here. Which brings me to the second question here, whether these horizontal distinctions are they really based on labor market experience, or are they in reality based on field of education? Or to put it perhaps a little bit more clearly, I have the suspicion that the intuition that there is something to these distinctions comes more from observation from universities, that it's more based on, rather than based on the political preferences of certain occupations, it's based on tendencies among that we as university teachers can observe among students. And I think one detail that I think is pretty telling in the Öesch schema is that he actually codes academic economists as a type of organizational work logic, whereas most of the other academics are coded as socio-cultural professionals, which is where I think that they belong. And that, to me, and there could definitely be something to that, right? I mean, especially if you think about the mechanism of that, if the mechanism behind the connection between work logics and political attitudes are the generalization of problem-solving strategies, it seems pretty plausible to me that it would be in the educational system that you actually learn about these problem-solving strategies, and that it has its origins there. But then again, even in the educational system, it might, of course, also once again be based on self-selection mechanisms rather than a causal effect of the education as such. Okay, the clock has turned 2, and that was the presentation that I had prepared. I'm looking forward to hear your comments and questions. And yeah, I'm leaving the word to you then again, Magne. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a very concise and very interesting presentation, Dr. Vestin. I see we have quite a large audience, so And also quite a few names here, I would imagine, have some reflections or something to offer to this discussion. I would only say that since we are so many people, it would be better if people could use the raise hand function in Zoom. Seems to me that the precise location of the raise hand function differs between versions of Zoom, but in my version, it's under the reactions tab at the bottom of at least my window. So if you would just raise your hand and we could let people ask or comment. I was wondering, while we're waiting for someone to sign up, if I could ask you like a very general or perhaps too broad question. But I think to me, and I think to some other people, the failure of the Öesch scheme to kind of improve upon the findings here is a bit of a surprise. I think.
Yeah,
it kind of
was to me too.
Yeah, exactly. Because it kind of intuitively seems that this should be better at accounting for these patterns. And so I wonder if I could just ask you, in very broad terms, why doesn't it perform better? Is it because like the schema or the underlying ideas of the schema are spurious in a way that doesn't really account for the differences between occupations and people? Or that may be putting it too generally, but what do you think? Why doesn't this work better?
Yeah, this is why I regret so much that we didn't look into whether this is the same, whether these schemas explain the same variation or different variations, right? Because if it turns out that it's the same schema, then the answer simply is that the work logic distinctions doesn't really have that much explanatory power. And as I showed you in that more where in that graph where I had put the different classes into different graphs there. I mean, it's not like the trend that the new left growth is associated with sociocultural professionals. It's not. Yes, there is some association there, but it's not that strong, really. So that would, I guess, be my first answer anyway, the trends that Öesch and also others write about, yes, they are there, but they're not as strong as you would when compared to the like trends of like I don't know, the working class leaving the Social Democrats, for example. These trends are very weak in comparison. So that would be my first starting point anyway.
Well, we have a full hour or 55 minutes for questions, so just feel free to ask anything.
If you want me to expand on that, I mean, it could also be the case here that the Swedish case is simply a little odd here. I wouldn't totally dismiss that such an objection. As I try to get into that the when I looked at the when I did the panel data study, I looked into the ESS data more closely in order to in order to make my replication, I had to show that my data had the same patterns as the same cross-sectional patterns as the Kitchelt and Rehm study. And when I looked closer, it turned out that yes, the Swedish National Election Studies has the same patterns as the Swedish survey in the ESS data set, but the correlations between like things like income and party choice, for example, it looks not really as you would, and especially the interaction between income and work logics looks a little different in Sweden compared to many other, especially many other continental European countries. So it's not totally impossible that Sweden could be a bit of an odd case here, I would say.
Well, it is surprising because I think from some of the earlier research, Sweden is like one of the countries where class was seen to have a very strong influence on the vote, with a very strong labor movement and everything. So
yeah, and Öesch is also. I mean, he also studies Sweden in his dissertation. So that's one of my arguments in the article, that why we should take this case seriously still. Yeah. But it's but in the end, it's of course it's an empirical question about how the other countries turn out as well.
We have two questions. First, I think, is Linus Westhäuser. You don't have any sound, Linus? Maybe your mic is not plugged in or something. Right. Okay. Should we let Marn go first, and then Linus can come back once he has his mic sorted out?
All right. Do you hear me okay?
Yep.
Good. Thank you so much for this very nice presentation. We've had a series of seminars on politics and class now, so that's been very good, and I feel like yours complemented the other ones.
Thank you.
And I agree with Magne that some of your findings are a bit surprising, which is always a bit exciting, I guess. But I was thinking about your design of looking at people who change positions and whether or not that influences their change of vote. And particularly maybe in context of the deviant study you mentioned that also exploited a panel structure to look at the association between vote and position. And I wonder, I mean, if we go back both to the neo-Marxian right, or even if we go back to Marx, I mean, the idea that your mobility trajectory would influence your interests and your objective interests is already there. So I wondered if you find any, or if you've looked into whether people who are on different career paths, so even if they're in the same position, if that has any implication for their political stances. So if you have looked into not only to change from one position to the other, but have you over time, are you on a career path upwards, or are you downwards, or are you stationary, and whether or not that influences your political outlooks?
Yeah, thank you. I did some quick regressions on I mean, where I had a particular category for the very highest managerial positions, so to speak. But unfortunately, the power of these studies, of this data at that, when you make such fine distinctions, become quite low. I didn't find any statistically significant results there, but I wouldn't say. I mean, that's a null, very much a null result, in the sense that I don't think it really tells us something substantive, really. I mean, we probably need some more power in that kind of analysis to really be able to say something. But and the same really goes for different. I'm not 100% sure about what you meant by career paths here. I tried to look at this in all kinds of directions, so to speak. I mean, because you have one analytical problem in order to test that theory is that you have to test for kind of all kinds of possible changes from any work logic to another, and already there you get quite a groups that becomes very small pretty quickly. But the short answer is that when I try to look into that, into those finer groups, I didn't really find anything either. It was all a null results all the way. One thing that I could imagine that you could find effect here is that I mean, what I had here was a two-step panel. It's 3 to 4 years between the time points, and I have to admit that I'm not really sure. I mean, you can't really see in the data exactly when during these time points that the respondent actually changes occupation. So there's definitely good possibilities to improve the empirics here, I would definitely say. Yeah.
Right, thank you. I have another question signed up as well. I'm just curious whether Linus has sorted out his microphone or...
I think now it should work. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can see you. You're under an alias now, but yes.
Yeah, I had to switch to another computer because it wasn't working. Never-ending story. But so thanks a lot for the presentation. I found myself nodding the whole time, so I think it's a really great contribution. And so that also kind of makes it a bit hard to ask a question, but still I wanted to just, so more like to maybe think out loud, because I'm also using the Öesch scheme, and I had all these doubts that basically you spelled out and confirmed now, because I also feel like it's very mechanistic in its theory that the work logics so in such an easy way should shape how people think. I think that's very simplistic. It's not really how social life actually functions. And then, by the way, because you mentioned Macarena Ares, she also has another article where she shows that also the predictions don't work out for the worker side, for the working class side, because there's no difference between the service and the production workers. So, which should, of course, also behave very distinctly because of those work logics, but there are no differences. So I think that's also a very strong argument.
Yes, that's a very interesting finding. I'll have to check that out, definitely.
But on the other hand, so, I mean, you mentioned the Krise article from '89, and I think this is why the scheme became so prominent, is because it started from the diagnosis of this new cleavage, right? And kind of theorized back from that finding. So I think in the background of this whole Öesch scheme is always this idea of a different conflict logic as well, right? Not just a different occupational logic. And this is something that I, using also Öesch for the German case, do in fact find. So I'm using multiple correspondence analysis, and in a way, the different occupational groups, they are in the right place. So you see the sociocultural professionals in terms of their political attitudes showing up exactly in the liberal pro-redistribution corner where they are supposed to be. So I was wondering, because it seems in the way you present it as well, is that, so it's a deficient scheme for explaining class voting, but clearly there is something there, right? Which we are all kind of looking for. So maybe it would also help to get clear what is that, and what is it maybe instead that we are looking at, that Öesch was only kind of the first step towards understanding.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, if you look, I mean, in Öesch's dissertation, this is one thing that I felt I should have been more fair to him about in my presentation, is that, I mean, politics for him is just one aspect of what he considered this class schema to be useful for. I mean, a lot of his dissertation is rather about things like institutional coverage, for example. How well are people in these groups protected by the welfare institutions, for example, and so I mean, even if it doesn't play out in politics the way you would perhaps expect it to, then that's still, it may still be a very useful schema for many other purposes. I would definitely sign on to that. Yeah.
Thank you. We also have a question directly from your list of references here. Peter Langseter has told me in the chat that he wants to raise a comment.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Erik. How are you? Thanks for a great presentation. As you know, I've enjoyed reading your thesis. But I just started thinking about when you mentioned this Sweden that might be an odd case. That made me think, and I can't remember right now if you addressed that in in the dissertation or not, but I actually think that you can make the argument that Sweden is the best possible case, the most likely case for Öesch's theory to work, because in his own writing, he says that there are three developments in particular that leads to these changes in the labor market that requires a new class schema, and that is welfare state expansion, women's entry into the labor force, and the increasing size of the tertiary sector. And all those three developments have probably come the furthest, or at least very far, in Sweden compared to many other countries. So if anything, you should expect the Öesch schema to perform best in Sweden, or at least better than most other places. And the development should be most clearly visible over time in Sweden. So I think you could actually flip it a bit, and instead of being on the defensive and saying it's odd, I would rather be on the offense and say that it's probably the best possible test case. And thanks. That's my comments.
Yeah, thank you very much for saying so. For you saying so, Peter. That it's good that it's nice that you have somebody else. Always nice to have somebody else argue for your own research in that way. And yes, I agree. I mean, and as I said earlier, I mean, Sweden is one of the cases that Öesch studies himself in his dissertation. So I suspect that he would admit that it's an important case. It's just that, as I said, it was just that these variable relations really stood out to me, and it's an interesting feature of class voting in Sweden overall. I think that if you look at income rather than occupation, you'll find that the Social Democrats has historically been extremely strong with people who are in the not in the very top of the income distribution, not the top 15%, but if you look at like the 7th and the 8th decile of the income distribution, it's I mean, they are just as strong there as they are in like the 2nd and the 3rd decile, I think. And so that's something to consider, but yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that there are also strong arguments to make here that Sweden is a very important and should be a typical case in the light of what Öesch himself says. So yeah, thank you for saying that for me.
Right, excellent. We have two more questions now. I think Adrian first, and then David.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for a super interesting presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I was just thinking, it's been mentioned that these findings are kind of surprising. And I'm thinking that it could be turned on its head. It's sort of not surprising, since you're basically confirming previous findings, right, of the decline in class voting. So these two schemas that you test, one of them doesn't perform much better than the other in explaining voting behavior. So I sort of want to challenge you a bit and ask, what do you think does explain voting behavior nowadays? What has sort of replaced class as the important predictor of voting behavior?
Yeah, that's a question. No, I mean there have been. This is just one example, I think, of several attempts that have been made to find these very broad social categories that supposedly then describes the connections between different parties and different social groups, right? Hans-Peter Krisi, of course, also has done a lot on the winners and losers of globalization distinction, which I know that Peter has also written about that and explained why that doesn't really work either. And there have been more attempts to split the middle class in different ways as well. But I do suspect that we simply have to accept the idea that that there hasn't really, that the old social cleavages haven't really been replaced by something, that the political communities that used to exist in the past, well, not so very distant past, but we at least on a political level have gone from having these very strong connection between specific social groups and specific parties to having a more of a society where these many of these intermediary organizations have declined as well, and we haven't seen any replacements of neither unionization nor church membership or something like that. That of course doesn't mean that class society has gone away in any way whatsoever, right? But or that we have that, or that we don't have that have higher inequality than since for many decades. But it simply means that my own conclusion, actually, both as a politically active person, has been that this speaks in favor of more of an mobilization or organizational perspective on politics rather than a structural one. That structural factors are simply not, their influence on people's views and political behavior is simply too vague or too broad to really lead people into the kind of political homogeneity, or what you might call it, that we had in the era of high class voting. But what it takes to achieve that kind of high class voting is really strong organizational tactics. And then of course we have to discuss whether, I mean, there's a strong case to be made, I think, that the preconditions for that have declined also as well. I mean, I'm writing together with Patrick Vulkan, who is also here in the audience today. We are writing about the decline of union membership in Sweden right now, and it seems like one important factor in that is that the structural transformation of the economy has led to I mean, sectors where organization is more difficult have grown, whereas there are fewer jobs in industrial sectors which are more where the concept of unionization is I think a lot more useful to achieve better conditions for workers. I don't know. It feels like I feel like this answer became very broad, but but I think we should. I suspect that we should try to look for emphasizing organizations more may be an idea, rather than keep looking for these broad structural factors, because I've simply become very skeptical about whether those structural factors really do that much in and of themselves.
This is a very interesting point. Thanks for making it. We have one more question here from David Adwell.
Hi, thanks for a really excellent presentation. I just had two quick questions. One of them is a bit more empirical, and then the other one is maybe a little more theoretical. So on the empirical side, I was just curious, what kind of lag structure should we expect for the change between occupation and values, right? How many years do we think it takes someone to work in a job for it to start affecting the way they see the world in a value kind of level? So that's the first question. And then on the theoretical question, I was kind of just interested how much you make of the RS finding. You suggested, I was just really interested, you said that you thought maybe what her data was picking up was the way in which people move up within a kind of occupation, up the occupational ladder, that's changing their values. So I'm just curious as to how much you make of that. Does that mean that maybe some of the changes in class voting could have to do with organizational changes or occupational kind of upgrading or these kinds of things? So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those are very good questions too. Let me see now. if we talk about the second question first about the occupational upgrading there, that's a bit of a speculation on my behalf, but because I think that the organizational work logic and the independent work logic that we definitely need, I think, more studies of the effects of class position using panel data more broadly, because I think we have many theories there that we rely on and take them as self-evident, but maybe it would be a nice time worth to actually test them. With regard to the this whole like employer and being becoming more of a manager type of thing, I mean that would, to me at least, seem just as plausible, but it would also, you can discuss whether this explanation is, I guess you can discuss whether this explanation is distinct from work logics and from but there's definitely something there that I think kind of interests, at least there's something slightly different about at least if you assume that work logic is supposed to be, the way I read it, it's supposed to be this very long-term explanation about how people view the world, whereas what I'm thinking about in terms of like becoming a manager or employer is that you're at least, especially when you become your employer, then it's pretty clear that your whole structural economic setting, so to speak, the kind of rules or your objective interests, if I may use that term, changes much more clearly than what they do if you change your work logic. I'm not really sure if I responded there, but I'm going to try to move on to the other question, and you have to remind me again. Sorry, what it was about it was also about the work logics, but.
No problem. Yeah, I think the other question was about how long we would expect a change in occupation.
Yes. I have some discussion about this in my article. Where I put the emphasis on the argument that you could actually expect that this effect should be not that long, really, or at least that this 2 to 3 year window time frame that you might expect that I have in my data should be enough. I mean, I argue from essentially from the Feldman and Saller article, A Simple Theory of Survey Response, where they say that attitudes are essentially a function of what different kinds of considerations people have on top of mind when they ask a question, when they are asked a question like this and about politics or whatever. And you might certainly I think it certainly could be the case. At least it seems plausible to me that within a year or two, at least when you have been at least when you've gotten some experience in your field, you should be familiar with the new types of considerations that you didn't think of before, but you should have been exposed to these new situations that you need to solve in order to do your job properly. So I got the objection at my thesis defense about, but shouldn't we? Isn't this a very short time frame? I definitely buy that it could be worth testing if you find effects more in the long run. But I don't think the theoretical case for that needs to be the case is particularly strong, really. No. So I think 1 to 2 years, I think should be well enough here.
Well, thank you. I haven't registered anyone else raising their hand now. If anyone has a problem with the function, they can put something in the chat or let me know otherwise. I was wondering if I could just follow up briefly on something you were talking about a bit earlier. I have to put up a warning that a vaguely formulated question is coming, but I was thinking about what you were saying about the need for organizational perspectives, and you were beginning to think, or increasingly thinking, that structural factors don't do things by themselves in a way, which I think is which to me seems to be an entirely plausible point, very, very well founded. And I think there's been a lot of issues, perhaps also in political science, but certainly in sociology, where people have expected some kind of mechanical effects of people's position in social structures. Whereas you advocated now the need to have a lot more organizational perspective, which I take to mean something like the role of trade unions or labor parties or other kind of organizations or parties in bringing or shaping people's attitudes, mobilizing them for distinct causes and something like that. I was just thinking, couldn't you kind of think these two in a connection, that you would see labor unions as organizing people who have this, to a certain extent at least, a distinct structural position, and it's easier to organize people who are structurally similarly located in a way? It's difficult to build alliances between people with very different resources and very different levels of marketable skills or work logics, and easier to organize people in a similar position. So I don't know, maybe this could be said as perhaps the organizational work in a way mediates the structural position or something. That's not a good phrasing, but
yeah, I guess when you put it that way, one thing that strikes me is that maybe one should put it like this, that I mean, I agree that there are. I would agree that there are structural factors behind the organizational decline as well. That seems to me to be a very plausible thing to say, that as certain sectors of the labor market has expanded and others have shrunk, those that have grown are parts of labor market where you have strong structural. Where it's simply more difficult to organize people into unions, and it may not even be. You may not even be able to promise them the kind of rewards that you could get from unionization in an industrial setting. But maybe what one way to put this in a different way is that what created the large levels of class voting in the past really was not just that it was that in order to create the high levels of class voting in the past, it wasn't enough with the structural aspects here, right? But it also required some strong organizational efforts. But then again, I mean, there's you can get very much into the. I mean, this is an area where, with regard to unionization, is an area where I know much less of the about the empirical specifics. But on the other hand, I guess you can say that at least in Sweden, the strength of the labor movement and the organizational or the political strength of the labor movement and the organizational strength of the labor movement is also something that goes very much hand in hand. I think I mean, when me and Patrick have been looking at unionization data, you can pretty clearly see that there is there is this idea that, well, everyone used to be in a union in the past, but I mean, if you look at Sweden, I mean, it's pretty clear that the peak unionization in Sweden was in the 1990s, and it's very much not that the union level of, I mean, in the beginning of the 19th century, the unionization level in Sweden, I think, was like 10% or something. I mean, it was nothing compared to the numbers that the labor unions reached then in the post-war era, when they were already politically strong. So I don't know, teasing out the causality here is still very much a challenge. I guess that's yeah. I have to get out of these answers now, so I'm stopping there.
Yes, indeed, thorny issues. I haven't seen anyone raising their hands now, so unless someone raises their hand quickly, we'll go towards finishing the session. I was wondering if I could just ask you a more general question to sort of hint at a conclusion, because I think you alluded to this earlier, but also in your Twitter profile, you're self-proclaimed social democrat and a political person as well. So I was wondering, what do you think of the political implications of your own work here for say, Swedish social democracy or the trade unions or something like that?
Yeah, I guess that's I guess I alluded to that earlier. That one implication that I have drawn from this, and also from other work, I've been reading a lot of the political scientist Ethan Öesch, who I think has written some of the. He coined the concept of political hobbyism, which I think is one of the best concepts that we have come up with in political participation in the last years. And what I have, and he also he comes from this from more of a, not really from a class politics view perspective, but more from political participation more broadly, and why do we see such decline in political parties and so on, while we still see a very large interest in politics and in terms of media consumption, and if you look at surveys, people say they are more than ever say that they are interested in politics and so on, and he sees this modern type of interest in politics as something that you follow them only via the media, and which particularly on social media, which he then thinks strengthens the, so to say, sports aspect of politics, further that you become more of a fan, and it's more about cheering on your team rather than actually organizing and trying to working more patiently to create preconditions for change in the larger scheme. This is that you actually take more active part, and rather than just reacting to the news, basically. And and partly through that, and partly through these results, my conclusions have been that at least for me as a person, that I want to try to learn to do this type of more organizing work, which is, in one way, it's a very easy type of when you try to explain what it is to people, it always turns out very banal. I think it's mostly about talking to people, being kind to them, and showing understanding for their perspective, and making yourself look sympathetic. But for someone like for an naturally introvert academic like myself, it can definitely still be a bit of a challenge. But I still think that if I can see sort of that's the part. That's the area where I can see some kind of hope for my own political ideology or preferences for the future. But we'll see. I mean, that's one. That's yeah. I don't really know how to finish here, but thank you. Thank you for asking that. It's a very relevant and interesting question, I think, too.
Thank you, and I think that strikes a nice note for our conclusion here. So I think we'll just thank everybody for participating and for asking lots of really great questions. And for those of you who want more of the same, or more, perhaps not exactly the same, but more in the same vein, I can recommend just following us on Facebook or on Twitter, where we'll announce new seminars continuously. So thanks everyone for watching, especially thanks to you, Dr. Vestin, for telling us so much about your very exciting research, and hope to see you all later.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Fleming, for inviting me here. It's been a real pleasure to come here and to present in front of. This is a very, it was a very nice audience to meet. Some of your names I totally recognize, that I have seen you in both on Twitter and on the and in the publication records, of course. And I'll definitely hope that we'll to be able to meet you in maybe this and hopefully also other forums in the near future. So thank you very much for listening.